During World War II, men were not the only ones showing their patriotism by contributing to the war. Women at the time were also showing their signs of patriotism by making enormous contributions to the United States. For example, entering the workforce, nursing the injured and ill, and entering the war. The establishment of the Nurse Army Corps showed many opportunities for women in education and in military. At the time, there were more than 59,000 women who served in the U.S. Army Corps during World War II. These women worked closely near the front lines, under fire, in evacuation zones, under harsh weather conditions, on hospital trains, ships, and medical transport planes. Their skills and determination and patriotism saved thousands of American lives during World War II. Women who never worked before showed their patriotism by stepping into the workforce and picking up the jobs men left behind. During this time, the female percentage of U.S. workforce increased from 27 to almost 37%. These women were known as Rosie the Riveters, after an iconic propaganda poster encouraging women to the workforce. These women became crucial to the war effort because there was such a high demand for the production and manufacturing of war materials. During World War II, the biggest contribution of patriotism the women showed was entering the war. The WAC, also known as the Women's Army Corps, authorized a voluntary enrollment program for up to 150,000 women to join the U.S. Army in a non-combat capacity. They played a huge part in the war, contributing to the national war effort by supplying men, military equipment, and resources for the war. They were the first women other than nurses to serve within the ranks of the United States Army. At first, they weren't taken seriously but proved men wrong. Another way women entered the war was the WASP, Women's Air Force Service Pilots. The WASP was created to help the short supply of pilots after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The WASP flew every aircraft in the U.S. Army's arsenal. They also transmitted equipment and non-flying personnel and flight-tested aircrafts that had just been repaired.
Prior to World War II, women were either stay-at-home mothers or usually worked as secretaries, receptionists, and store clerks. When America entered World War II, many men went off to war due to the draft, so women started taking the places of men in jobs. Or they were either chemists and engineers developing new weapons, and some even had the opportunity to work on the Manhattan Project creating the atomic bomb. 5 million women entered the workforce between 1940 and 1945. World War II led to women taking jobs in defense plants and factories across the country. These jobs were usually dominated by men, and many women resisted taking them. For example, the aircraft industry women hesitated to take, but by 1943, majority of women worked there. To solve the problem of women hesitating to take the job, the government created a propaganda poster, and it was called Rosie the Riveter. Rosie was tough yet feminine at the same time. Many women looked up at Rosie as someone they wanted to become in the workforce. For example, women who did not want to work, there was volunteer opportunities as well. For example, the American Red Cross encouraged women to volunteer with local city chapels. Millions of women also organized community social events for families, packed and shipped almost 500,000 tons of medical supplies overseas, and prepared 27 million care packages of non-perishable items for American soldiers and other Allied prisoners of war. Military service was another option for women. Over 350,000 women served in several all-female units of military branches. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many women thought it would benefit them to come to California due to new working opportunities opening up. During this time, many women were not able to have the same opportunities as others. African American women struggled to find jobs, and when they did, white women were often unwilling to work next to them. Not only African women were discriminated, but also Japanese American women were too. Japanese American women in Western states had little to no opportunities due to the Japanese internment.
World War II brought many good things for women, but they also faced a lot of oppression during the war and even after. Women in the workforce that took over a quote-unquote man's job faced a lot of judgment and difficulties. They had to deal with oversized men's work clothes or went to work in skirts and casual clothes. Not only were they not provided proper work clothes, but they also did not have the correct protection. Later, once the factories realized that all these women were going to keep those jobs for longer than anticipated, they finally were provided with overalls and formal work clothes. Something that some women still struggle with today and during that time is equal pay compared to men. Trade unions were concerned about the wages of men after the war, And when the government was informed, they were more concerned about the recruitment of workers. And finally, when there was some agreement about wages, women still didn't get equally paid as men because they do jobs that men would do without assistance or supervision. It wasn't just women in the workforce that faced oppression, but it was also women that served in the army. They were faced with the fact that their male counterparts thought that these women were not as skilled, or just at the fact that they were women. For example, Evelyn Fraser was a WAC and served 2 tours as a captain in public information. Throughout her story, she recalls that the men did not take them very seriously, and that during one of her tours, she suggested something to the general, and I quote, "He told his male officers that it was funny that a WAC had to suggest such a practical thing." Overall, this oppression was happening to all women, even if they had nothing to do with the war. Japanese American women were faced with oppression in the internment camps, and as long as you were not from Japanese ancestry, you had an opportunity to work and somehow help during the war. But for Japanese American women, they did not have the opportunities that all the other women had, or even the opportunities that Japanese American men had to get out of the internment camps.
Not only were men affected by the war, women were also greatly affected. They made so many sacrifices and their way of life changed. Many had to live with the thought that their husbands might not make it back, and they had no clue whether they were alive or not. Japanese American women and African American women also had so much to sacrifice. Their husbands and sons also went into battle, and they also had to live with the thought that their loved ones might not make it back. It was worse for them because their loved ones were fighting for a country that discriminated them. White women in support were fighting the war from home while their husbands were in battle. These women began getting jobs. They began taking over all the jobs that were left behind by the men going into war. Women began working in jobs they had never worked in before, and even mothers began working. These working mothers had a harder time because they were trying to raise their children and work at the same time. Many women went to work even if they had children they had to care for. These mothers that did work were able to work because they either had relatives or daycare centers where their children were taken care of. Some mothers couldn't work because they couldn't find anyone to take care of their children. These mothers had to stay as housewives. For those working, it was a way for them to support the war effort and show their husbands they were there for them. Those women that served in the military also had their sacrifices. They tried to prove themselves and show they were capable of flying planes. These women that flew the planes never went into combat, but 38 women did die while flying them. These women's sacrifices shouldn't go unnoticed because they gave up and risked so much. Each woman had their own sacrifice that they made during the war, from having to live without a loved one, raising children on their own, having to work, and some even working instead of staying home with their kids. They did all of this in order to get money to help the family, to prove themselves, or to help the war effort.